BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? For quite some time, I've been meaning to go through the Suburban Nightmare series, which is available on Tubi, and as a streaming service, Tubi actually has a lot of true crime content. Suburban Nightmare is one of their original series, and I did one response to Suburban Nightmare JonBenet Ramsey and did an episode about that here on Black Box Online Radio. On the weekends, I've been doing a regular segment about JonBenet, and I saw that they had some other episodes, one on Chris Watts, which I'll be discussing today, as well as on the Menendez brothers, which I'm looking forward to going through in perhaps the rather distant future. But in terms of true crime content, Tubi also has some older documentaries that still have stood out to me in a particular way, most notably the one on Albert Fish, which I hope to watch very soon. That's going to be at the top of my list because recently I was talking about the serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and Dr. Todd Grande once called him just a psychological mystery, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said that Richard Ramirez was just so odd and they couldn't quite figure out what was going on with him, and I absolutely disagreed with that. I just said Richard Ramirez was a jerk who got out of control, and he was a conventionally mean person whose behavior just escalated in a very devious way. But with Albert Fish as a serial killer, he was called the Moon Maniac, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and most famously the Gray Man. There are just so many different layers to his destructive behavior, and there is something there to explore. In a bad way. I mean, absolutely recognizing that all serial killers and murderers, like Chris Watts, who was not a serial killer but a murderer, they are wrong, their actions are bad, they deserve no praise, but at the same time we also want to learn more about humanity and understand the elements around these types of horrific crimes. And if anybody would like to follow along with these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button, subscribe. That is perhaps one of the best ways to help out this channel. Also, if your friends or family are curious about true crime cases, you can share Black Box Online Radio on social media. And there is also the page on buymeacoffee.com under the name BlackBoxNed88. That's the same as my Instagram handle. But buymeacoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88, that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support this channel, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. There's a link for that in the description box. But I've talked about Chris Watts in the past on Black Box Online Radio, but not for quite some time. Firstly, this goes back to 2018. On August 13th of that year, Chris Watts murdered his family, and this saw the deaths of his wife Shanann, his two daughters, Bella and Celeste, who was known as Cece, and even the death of his unborn child. Shanann was murdered by strangulation, and the two girls were murdered by suffocation. And Chris Watts was an oil worker, and he buried Shanann's body in a shallow grave, and he dumped the bodies of his two children into the oil, and a lot of questions were raised, not only by the actions of Chris Watts, but also about why this particular case became so frequently shared in the media. And if you watch Suburban Nightmare, that's how it begins. They're immediately talking about not only the media, but also social media and the connections and sharing information, and how a lot of that led to Chris Watts being captured, but also just how people were learning about things related to this case. And even Shanann Watts, the victim, was heavily involved in online sales using the internet all the time. And as soon as she went missing, then people started sharing things on Facebook about her. But the first documentary that I watched about Chris Watts back in 2019 was one that was made purely out of primary source footage. Like, they only had like police body cams and dash cams and 911 calls, and maybe they had some graphics over the 911 call, but the audio would have been a primary source. The police interrogations, the courtroom, and Suburban Nightmare actually had a particular benefit that even though they're not using only primary sources, they had a lot of panelists and commentators and people analyzing the statements that are made by Chris Watts. So this guy's an oil worker, and he murdered his family, what is called a family annihilator as opposed to a serial killer. And so many people were just raising these questions about what on earth could have happened. And for starters, Chris Watts met Shanann Watts when someone introduced them on Facebook or made a suggested friend request. And on their first date, they shared this in Suburban Nightmare that Shanann had a migraine and Chris let her put her head on his lap, and she fell asleep for 3 hours, and he didn't move at all, and she thought that he was caring and kind and supportive, and he actually was looking out for her, and they went on to get married. But into their marriage, some things happened around the same time. Firstly, they went into debt, $70,000 in debt, and they were being sued by their homeowners association for not making payments. And I mean, that I don't think is a big enough motive to commit homicide, but that is definitely something that would have taken a toll on the marriage with a new baby on the way. But also, Chris began to lose an enormous amount of weight. He lost 65 pounds, and he was even trying to lose more. And he was also getting in shape, exercising a lot, and he received a lot of attention from other people. So one woman whom Chris connected with was named Nicole Kessinger, and they developed a romantic affair. Chris began cheating on his wife, and they on Suburban Nightmare, they said he had a secret app on his phone that looked like a calculator, but it was actually a photo file where he could store the photos from the affair so his wife wouldn't find out. I've never heard of that before, and that just sounds like some really sneaky stuff, and you gotta wonder about the person who comes up with an app like that. But Chris is having the affair, and some people are saying he's going through a midlife crisis. He was trying to get out of his marriage, but at the same time, he had 2 daughters and another baby on the way. And this raises the questions about why he chose to respond to this, to the situation in the destructive manner in which he did. I mean, some people can walk away, some people can get divorced, some people can start over, and why did it have to go to the point of homicide? And Dr. Todd Grande did a video on Chris Watts talking about the reasons why people become family annihilators, and he said that Chris Watts didn't fit into the conventional reasons, but there is something called immortalization, and I was discussing that in an old podcast that I did back in 2019, and somebody told me that I was misusing the term because I said, to me, this seemed clear as day, that it's like immortalization, but Chris Watts was thinking that his family was going to be broken. He didn't want to stay with his wife Shanann, and he wanted to move on and be with his new girlfriend Nicole. However, he didn't want the kids to grow up in a broken home, not to mention the financial stress. I mean, divorce plus $70,000 in debt. They were raising 3 children in financial ruin. He was thinking that they've already reached the best times of their life. It's never going to get any better. He's going to put Shanann and the two children, and even his unborn child, out of their misery, so then he can start over with his new girlfriend. And it's a purely selfish reason, and that's why I even called the first episode I ever did on Chris Watts the world's most selfish murderer, because, I mean, he murdered his family mostly for his own benefit. Even if somebody is thinking like that, that's a deranged and twisted thing to do. And somebody responded in the comments section saying, I'm misunderstanding the concept of immortalization. Immortalizing someone in the sense of the family annihilator is more like they want the spirit or soul of the dead to go on and live in heaven or something like that. Therefore, they're going to destroy their earthly body so that they can exist in a different type of way, in a way that cannot be broken or harmed. Immortalization. And I completely follow that. I completely get that. But this is why we talk about things, and this is why I was talking about the benefits of commentary and analysis, because you can use terms and ideas in a different way. And I stand by all of the claims that I just said about Chris Watts right now, that he thought his family was never going to receive any type of benefit on Earth. He thought there would be no good that would come from staying with a family, having a divorced wife, and raising 3 children in just abject poverty, more or less, and they would have lost their house, or the house would have gone away in the divorce, and then what is it going to be? Just two parents in tiny little apartments and mounting bills and people just sinking into debt even more. And for most people, they would just do that. I mean, they would just do that. I mean, that's how a lot of families grow up. And America, sad to say, they don't take the destructive action of murdering them as a way to get out of a problem. And it's disgusting. And that's why I think there is this particular fascination with the Chris Watts case, because it just seemed so obvious, and so that he was doing this for destructive and selfish purposes, and it has to show that he was somewhat of a deranged individual to begin with. He put on the facade of being a very gentle, soft-spoken person, and also calm and collected. Like, in Suburban Nightmare, they're always referring to him as cool, and they say that he has a cool facade. I don't think there's anything cool about him, and part of it's because of what we actually know now, but, I mean, Chris Watts is, in all of those police cam videos, I mean, he seems weak. He seems just out of it. He's like, oh, yeah, like, oh, I don't know what happened. And it's not very, well, it's not very convincing, but it's also just very bland. And I think that was his particular plan. But there is one person in the documentary that I've seen in several other films. Her name is CBI Agent Lee. She's the person who conducted the polygraph examination for Chris Watts. So his wife goes missing, and his daughters are missing too. Someone actually calls 911, and they say that just Shanann isn't responding to anything. There's no movement in the house. But also, once the police get there, they find that none of the belongings are missing, that Shannon's purse is still there, her phone is still there, and it's just very, very bizarre that, like, they've just vanished off the face of the earth, so it seemed. And ultimately, Chris Watts takes a polygraph test, and the person who conducted it, CBI Agent Lee, that's just how she was titled in the film, as well as the other documentaries, seemed to be someone who was very manipulative, but perhaps in a good way, because she's supposed to extract the truth out of someone. She's talking in a very light and gentle way. I said jite. I was trying to say light and gentle at the same time, and it came out as the word jite. She's talking in a very light and gentle way, but she's cutting through his attempted manipulations. And, I mean, I wouldn't want to go to a bar and drink with her, let's just say that, because I think that goes without saying. So, in other words, Chris Watts fails a polygraph test, and they say that he failed badly, and what Agent Lee was telling him was, you knew that you were lying, you knew, and you did it anyway because you wanted this to be over, you wanted to put an end to this, you know what really happened, and they are slowly finding out that Chris Watts was up to something very malicious. And you just have to wonder about those types of statements that are made by investigators, as well as the actions of Chris Watts himself. And I mean, they openly ask you this question in Suburban Nightmare. Did he take the polygraph thinking that he would pass, or was he just so caught up with the stress of murdering his family that he took the polygraph test knowing that he was lying and he wanted to get caught to put an end to it so he didn't have to live with this lie anymore. And I mean, some people are absolutely overcome with guilt and shame after committing a murder, and other people feel absolutely nothing. I think it really depends on how psychopathic or sociopathic a person is, on how they will feel after committing a horrible crime. But with Chris Watts, I'm seeing something in him that I'm curious about, that I've never experienced firsthand, of course. But when I watched a lot of these true crime documentaries, I have a particular observation that I've never heard in any other source, and that is that somebody hates their life, and they commit these destructive actions because they actually want to get arrested and go to jail. They might not want all of the aspects of going to jail. They might not want to be facing public shame and ridicule, but they hated their living situation. I'm talking about on a deep psychological level. They hated their living situation and they just wanted out of it. And one way to do that is to go to prison. And I also think about the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard very easily, the woman who had her mother murdered by her boyfriend Nick Godejohn because her mother was abusing her. I mean, it's very, very horrible things. And I have a couple episodes about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and you can also see a dramatization of that in the show The Act that was made available on Hulu. I believe it might have come out on a different network. I saw it on Hulu all the same. But I mean, those questions get asked. Are these people committing these types of crimes because they want to go to jail just to be free of the world that they're living in? But a big difference with Chris Watts is that he wasn't being abused by his mother. He wasn't even being abused by his wife, Shanann. In the text messages that have been revealed and that are even shared in Suburban Nightmare, she's talking about how she wants to have sex with him. Oh, it's been 5 weeks and we haven't had sex. I mean, she wants to be with him. She wanted to maintain the family life. And, all right, you got financial pressures and you're in debt or something. Again, if you actually wanted to maintain the marriage, other people can get out of that. Other people can find ways to solve the problems, not murdering the family. So that really goes to show that there was some type of deranged psychological issue with Chris Watts. And I'm going to throw this out there. I don't even know if I should say this, but there's a characteristic of narcissism that is related to caregiving. And I've said this before on BBR. I'm sure you've heard this somewhere about how narcissists are actually very good caregivers. And it's because the person is in a state in which they are dependent upon the narcissist. And I even think about some people whom I've known who have narcissistic tendencies, not naming any names, but when I'm sick and in bed, they would have been very attentive, bring you tea and juice, and would you like to watch something? Would you like to want me to turn on the television for you? I mean, all those types of things, very, very present, active, and there is no type of rudeness. They like actually step back from any type of twisted manipulation because they don't have to. The person is already in a state in which they are dependent upon a caregiver. And that story about Shanann putting her head in Chris's lap for 3 hours, that's what the first thing that I thought of. Now, is that actually some type of narcissistic issue? I'm not 100% certain. That does require some type of guesswork, but it is an interpretation of the behaviors all the same. Now, Chris Watts was having an affair with the woman named Nicole Kessinger, and it was actually a coworker first of his. She was a geologist, as previously stated. Chris Watts worked on an oil site, and worked at an oil site, and somebody wrote this into the comment section on Black Box Online Radio once, asking me a particular question. Do you think it's possible that Nicole Kessinger was the person who orchestrated the Watts family murders? And that it was all her idea. Chris carried it out, and that he would have been guilty of that, but she was the one who had instructed him to do that. And the evidence for this was that she had been following him on Facebook prior to the affair, and that this was her idea. He just carried it out so that they could have the relationship. And I'm tempted to say no comment, but I think that a stronger answer would be, I suppose that anything is possible, but perhaps there's insufficient evidence to support that. The authorities were very dismissive of that idea, and you can hear this when they're interviewing Chris Watts. They say very clearly, we don't think that she, referring to Nicole, had anything to do with this. And, I mean, if something like that did happen, I think another piece of evidence that isn't present would be that Chris would have said something at this point, trying to get a lighter sentence, trying to well, mostly that. He would definitely be going to jail, but perhaps for less time if he had some giant bombshell like that, that Nicole was responsible for orchestrating the crimes, which would have been a crime in itself. That's conspiracy to commit murder, or perhaps there's some other way of labeling it, but if she's the person who is calling the shots, then she is also going to be found guilty of something. But do I think that's actually what happened? Insufficient evidence to say so, but I understand the curiosity. I understand why somebody would ask that question, because it's leaving no stone unturned. It's examining a set of behaviors from people, and that's what we do on Black Box Online Radio. That's what you guys do in the comments section, and I encourage you to do that in the comments section. And we all get curious about true crime cases, and I've been trying to assemble a lot of the observations that I've made just watching documentaries like Suburban Nightmare, and putting them into order. Like, there are things that I begin to notice, patterns and trends and similarities, and I began to notice that criminals are behaving in certain ways, and I'm trying to assemble all of these observations in a very particular way, in an organized way rather, as opposed to just 30 minutes of rambling, and I would like to do something bigger with that in the future. I'm not quite sure what yet, but please look out for some new projects associated with Black Box Online Radio in the future, and as always, you can hit the like button and subscribe. But there's also an element that is explored in Suburban Nightmare, and that relates to how Chris Watts and his now deceased wife Shanann Watts functioned. And when I used the term calling the shots recently, they said that Shanann was actually the person who was calling the shots in the marriage, that she was perhaps the more dominant partner in the relationship. And once Chris began to lose weight, and once he began to get in shape, then he received a lot more attention from women, and he perhaps was rather dissatisfied with the relationship dynamic of having his wife calling the shots, and he was becoming more powerful perhaps in his own mind. They didn't use that exact word, powerful, but that's what I think they were going at, and that could have also been a contributing factor to the homicides, not only thinking that his family is either going to be miserable and alive or dead, and those were the two options, so he wanted them dead because he thought it would have been less painful for them to experience. Terrible, terrible way of thinking, but I do think he perhaps considered that. But then there could be an even more selfish motive. It's just that he wanted to be a powerful person. He wanted to commit that crime because that would have showed absolute dominance over his wife. I mean, murdering her and disposing of her bodies at his work site, nonetheless. It's always remarkable when people commit crimes like the way Chris Watts did. As we said, he strangled his wife and in the house, and his daughters were suffocated and smothered closer to the kill site. Well, closer to the dump site, excuse me, that became the kill site. But the fact that he didn't show any signs of, like, them leaving the house, he didn't, like, pack a suitcase or a bag with Shanann's belongings or the kids' belongings and then bury it somewhere and hide it someplace, make it look like they were going out. And he had young daughters who had car seats, and the car seats were still in the house. That was something else shared in Suburban Nightmare. All of those details were not found in the investigation. It's this very, very poor effort. And that's what I've been talking about when it says it's almost like somebody wanted to get caught so they could just escape their own mental prison in the mind, so to speak. They just didn't want to live in any type of functioning society. Just they want to go to prison because it just puts an end to all of the challenges. But the other particular details that were shared in Suburban Nightmare came from an FBI profiler who talked about one of the first things that Chris Watts did when he arrived at home after the call that his wife was missing was that he went to a car that was parked in the garage, and he opened the door and he looked under the front seat of the passenger side of the car. And the profiler was saying, that should have tipped everybody off that something was suspicious about the guy. I mean, he's looking for his wife or his daughters under the front seat of a car. I mean, it just shows that it's fake, it's staged, and it is something that isn't quite all put together. And he's faking it and doing a very bad job, not a convincing job at all. And the other point, though, that is a little bit more controversial is this profiler from the FBI said that if you don't see snot from a parent after their child has gone missing, they're usually not telling the truth. Meaning that tears, red in the face, puffy eyes, and yes, of course, even a runny nose when people have been crying extensively. If someone has actually been separated from their children, then they're going to spend all night crying about it. And I find those statements to be very hard to digest because people respond to tragedies in different ways, and we cannot have a type of universal expectation that there is, this is just how people respond after their kids go missing. I mean, I think that that is almost too much to say to people. Well, I mean, what if someone, because it's possible that someone could not know where their wife and daughters were and not be crying like that. Okay, you can be suspicious, but that does not signify guilt immediately. And I'm not talking about Chris Watts specifically, about anybody. People respond to tragedies in different types of ways. And, I mean, maybe Chris Watts just thought that he couldn't pull off the acting job of crying, or that it would look very fake, so he was just trying to be calm and collected. Or he was trying to be perhaps cooperative and show that he was aware of that people were looking for them, maybe putting on a puzzled and perplexed look rather than sad. So, I mean, that's probably something that entered his mind into at some point in time. But as far as his behavior, I mean, the police were onto him rather early, but he did take the lie detector test and he failed. Some people think that polygraph tests are absolutely useless, they're junk, they aren't reliable at all, that's why they're not admissible in court in about 30 states. I actually think much more highly of polygraph tests, and this would be a clear case of when perhaps we could look at a lie detector and say, well, I mean, it said that he was not telling the truth, and he was not telling the truth. And they said that not only did he failed badly. And one point, though, that was shared by the FBI profiler in Suburban Nightmare is that the lie detectors are not about telling if someone is actually lying. It's about whether or not somebody is truthful. And I talked about this in an episode that I did about the Steve Wilkos show, actually, where there are physiological tracings in the body where the brain uses different components. And if the brain is using certain components from your memory, you will give off certain physiological responses. Physiological meaning like the way that your body is responding to them. And if the brain is using something from your imagination, meaning something that is not a real memory, it gives off different responses, and the responses are actually much more intense because it requires a lot more mental energy to imagine as opposed to remembering. I mean, different parts of the brain. So, I'm not completely convinced, that lie detectors are perfect. In fact, they are not perfect. Sometimes people get inaccurate results. But there is the computerized polygraph, which is used now, which appears to be more accurate than the way they did things in the 80s, where it was all about heart rate, blood pressure, and galvanic skin tension. Then, okay, then if someone is just very calm, then in theory, they should be able to pass that. But I mean, I think that lie detectors are not perfect, but overall, they're probably a lot more accurate than what people are giving them credit for. And if you wanted to challenge me on any of these particular points, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. If you have any comments about Chris Watts and his horrible actions, you can put your comments in the section down below. And I would love to read your responses. What do you think about how I you use that remodeled version of immortalization about how he thought that his family could never live in a good way, so he wanted to murder them to put them out of their misery, or just to prevent them from experiencing the misery of growing up in broken homes. I mean, I would love to know your responses, again stating that's a terrible thing to do, but I do think he contemplated that. And you can also talk about the other reasons why people would commit the crimes like family annihilation, the conventional definition of immortalization. You can respond to that too. What do you think about the theory that Nicole Kessinger orchestrated these crimes? And also, what do you think about Chris's insecurity driving him to commit the murders, meaning that his wife was the dominant partner in the relationship, and once he improved his physical physique, then he gained a certain type of awareness that he didn't have to be the less dominant partner in the relationship. What do you think about all of those things and about how this person was driven to kill his family? And one more time, the documentary that I've been citing for this episode is Chris Watts' Suburban Nightmare, available on Tubi for free. Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Hit the like button and subscribe. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackboxNerd88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.